Alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum. Welcome to another edition of the Sulaimaan Ravat Show. It's Friday evening once again. We are coming to you live, as we always do, from our studios here in Sunninghill, Johannesburg. Now, after Ramadan, for a number of weeks, we were discussing topics other than political issues, especially local political issues, because we had such an intense amount of coverage on local politics leading into the elections. And then it was very spiritual during the month of Ramadan. So we kept it social the last few weeks, but now we're going back the political route, but more beyond the borders of South Africa. Today we take a look at various topical issues, various hotspots, if you like, within the Middle East region. And joining us in studio for a discussion and for interaction in this regard, from AMAC, we have Naeem Jinnah, who we welcome back to the program once again. Naeem, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
I don't know if this is a stupid question to start with, but I think in many ways it does pop up in people's minds. How come the Middle East is so much in focus?
Well, it's the most explosive region at the moment. I think that, in many ways, the Middle East has been in focus for many decades, particularly after the creation of Israel. And then we had the oil crisis, 73 or in the 70s. So it's always been kind of an important focus in terms of global politics. The Iranian Revolution in the late 70s, then the Iran-Iraq war. So it's been always there. But in the past 10 years, since the uprisings began, I think the focus has to some extent intensified. And some of those other ones that were in the limelight have kind of dimmed a bit, like the Palestinian issue in terms of the news. But because the past 10 years have seen unprecedented uprisings, and then you had counter-revolutions, you had two civil wars that are still going on, it's difficult to move the focus away from the region. And then you have additional things right now, which, for example, much of our news media is dictated by the West, in truth. And for the West right now, the Middle East and Africa both are a source of great problems from their perspective in terms of migration. And so it continues being in the news for these kinds of reasons, not always good reasons.
Does it have a impact on the profile of Muslims globally? I remember once on the plane, this one gentleman told me, but why are you Muslim guys always making headlines, especially in the Middle East? Now, you've touched on a few happenings recently and perhaps over the last few decades as to what brings the Middle East into the news. But what's the root issue? Would it be fair to say the kind of argument or counter-argument that Muslims sometimes make, if there wasn't that much of meddling and interference in the region, then the region wouldn't be in the state that it is, and it wouldn't be making headlines in the manner it was? Or is?
Yes, partly that's true. I have to say that because in October we're having an international conference on that topic, on foreign intervention in the Middle East. But no, that's partly it. But it's not just current or recent. I mean, to a large extent, it goes back to the colonial era and the end of colonialism. Right. When colonialism ended in the Middle East and North Africa in particular, the colonialists, particularly the British and French, but also the Russians, left behind particular kind of legacy. It was a legacy of monarchies, it was a legacy of military dictatorships, and the entire region has been suffering from that legacy since then, since the end of colonialism. And of course, the region was set up in that way in order to serve particular interests, particular Western interests. So that foreign focus, in a sense, foreign political focus, has to a large extent dictated the fact that the Middle East and North Africa are in the news, but also the fact of how they're portrayed in the news. Whether it's in terms of oil, whether it's in terms of terrorism, whether it's in terms of kind of silly romantic oil sheikhs, etc., as they would say, but it is these interests that have portrayed it in that way.
You touched there on how it is portrayed in the media. With social media coming to the fore in the last, say, 10, 15 years, has it brought a bit more balance in terms of coverage of happenings within the Middle East, simply because the mainstream established houses now that know they could easily be belied by an ordinary person on the ground who's got access to Twitter or to Facebook or to any of those social media platforms?
I think it has to some extent. It has to some extent because the information from the ground is more easily accessible. And so even the mainstream media kind of looks at what is being said on the ground. But nevertheless, the agendas are not very different. And the way in which the news is presented is adapted, but not very different in terms of serving those agendas. So, for example, let's take social media as in the way that it is used. You would find that social media and citizen journalism, if you like, through social media, plays a huge role in terms of how Western media would cover Iran. Because in general, the social media space, as far as Iran is concerned, is dominated by critics of the regime. But it would be different with, for example, how the Western media covers Saudi Arabia. Is not in terms of the social media citizen journalism type stuff. So it still fits into the broader agenda. It's just that the pool of information that's available is larger to the mainstream media. And in terms of ordinary people, I think that there is some change, but I would question how much of a change. Those of us that spend a lot of time on social media, we do think that it has this revolutionary potential, and that the world is changing because that's what we read. Except that social media, all of the social media, is driven by particular kinds of algorithms, and the pool that you're talking to and listening to is a particular type of pool. And so we often get fooled about what actually is happening or what actually people feel.
Yeah, just to pick up on that point once again, the consumer of news, so to speak, are they becoming a bit more discerning? Are they a bit less vulnerable to these established narratives that mainstream media try to push, call it propaganda, whatever you want to call it, via the established media platforms?
I would suggest, with the possibility of being corrected, I would suggest that in general, whether you're talking about the United States, you're talking about Europe, you're talking about South Africa, in general, the ordinary consumer of news doesn't make the effort to go and find out and research and look at different opinions, etc. The ordinary consumer of news in the United States watches CNN and Fox News, and CNN is the more quote-unquote progressive one. Okay, the ordinary consumer of news in South Africa gets the news from TV and radio. It is those that want to hear more that will do the extra work. Perhaps what I should concede is that I think that the fact that the news or the information is more easily available means that the group of those who want to know more is increasing. Because it is more easily available than it used to be. But I don't think we should be fooled that the vast majority of people are critical.
All right, time for us to take the first break. When we come back, we start talking about various aspects pertaining to recent happenings in the Middle East, and we'll start off with Iran after the break. Welcome back. So we are discussing the Middle East this evening on the program, and our guest in studio, Naeem Jina from AMAC. Naeem, the first discussion I want to have this evening is around Iran. But like we were speaking about media, before the break, and there's so many things happening, and at such a pace these days that sometimes you kind of lose the context a bit. So if for the benefit of the viewers, we could just go back a bit. Towards the end of the Obama era, it seemed like they were coming closer together, agreements, this kind of thing. Trump comes into office. Where did he start taking a turn in a different direction? Where did it start going wrong, this relationship between the US and Iran, after the upward trend, if you like, towards the end of the Obama administration?
For Trump, where it started going wrong was Obama signing the nuclear deal.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a few things that drive Trump. One of them is anything that Obama did, he needs to undo. And so the nuclear deal was part of that. If you consider, if you compare Trump's attitude towards Iran, which doesn't have nuclear weapons and claims, and I believe that they have no plans to develop nuclear weapons, to North Korea, which does have nuclear weapons and has tested them, a completely different response to the two. And with Iran, one of the reasons is that the deal was made by Obama and therefore it has to be gotten rid of. So he wants to make a new deal, which would be the Trump deal. That's the one thing. The second thing, of course, is that, which is also the second thing that drives Trump, is that he has a very conservative Christian fundamentalist constituency. And he wants to play to that constituency all the time, in terms of all the promises he made, but in general. And that constituency is very supportive of Israel, and Israel regards Iran as its mortal enemy. And therefore, Iran has to be the enemy.
So what have been the key issues around which now this latest round of tension has revolved?
Well, this is a difficult thing. I mean, the latest round of tension, in a sense, started when Trump withdrew the U.S. from the nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, as it is called, which was signed by Iran on the one side, and on the other side, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany. When Trump withdrew the U.S. from it, it wasn't just a withdrawal. It was a withdrawal from the treaty, but also the imposition of new sanctions, which from Iran's perspective, that era was over. The era of American sanctions was over. The sanctions began to be imposed and became worse than what they were. And the threat of secondary sanctions against other countries that dealt with Iran became stronger. And hence the difficulty. So it came to a point where, of course, the other 5 members, not Iran, but on the other side, the other 5 members who signed the treaty insist that they stand by it, but they haven't been able to concretely provide for Iran guarantees that it requires. So, for example, many European countries that after the signing of the deal began to move into Iran, actually before the signing of the deal, had already started going into Iran to develop business partnerships, etc. A number of them canceled contracts, started pulling back because of the effect that it might have from the United States and their market in the US and their ability to deal through US banks. So the Europeans haven't, from the Iranian perspective, come to the party in terms of their promise, which was that they would provide an alternate financial vehicle that would allow trade between Europe and Iran to go ahead. When that didn't happen, and with the sanctions, there have been a number of rounds of sanctions, and it gets as ridiculous as the United States imposing sanctions on the Iranian Murshid, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. I say it's ridiculous because he hasn't traveled out of Iran for decades. In his own name, he has virtually no money. So what are you really sanctioning? It's really a symbolic sanction, and it had the desired effect, which is that it angered the Iranians more than real sanctions would. Then, for the first time, they imposed sanctions on, or declared as a terrorist organization, part of an army of a sovereign state, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So the Americans have been ratcheting up the pressure, economically and otherwise. And the Iranians have been very measured in their response, but it seems have felt that they need to respond. They can't just sit back and accept. And so that's where we are now, with the British under Theresa May being basically a lackey of the United States, capturing that Iranian ship because the Americans wanted it to be captured.
What's the likelihood of the US actually going to the point of striking?
I think that they would be very careful about that. I don't think that they would easily strike Iran directly. I say this knowing full well that Trump is completely unpredictable. That he could wake up tomorrow morning and someone on Fox TV says we have to attack Iran, and he decides that it should be done. That's a complete possibility. But if we have to look at it a little more rationally, I don't think that the United States is going to strike Iran. But what they'll want to do is continue to intensify the pressure through other ways. So the manner in which they're dealing with the Straits of Hormuz now, bringing in more ships, a whole fleet, getting the Saudis and Emiratis to agree to be part of that fleet that will monitor it, trying to kind of push Iranian control over the Straits of Hormuz as far back as possible, in many ways kind of intensifying the pressure on Iran, and perhaps attempting to force Iran's hand. I don't think that that's going to succeed. And so the question is that if they don't succeed in forcing Iran's hand, if Iran doesn't do anything stupid, and the Iranians have made it clear, I mean, from their practice over the past 30 years, that they're not going to do anything stupid. If the Iranians don't do anything stupid, there is no guarantee that the Americans won't. And this is the difficulty where we are at the moment.
We know that in the US they're moving into an election season. Will this in any way have an impact on what Trump is likely to do in as far as Iran is concerned, in particular in the Middle East in general? Or is it like you alluded to earlier on, it just depends on which side of the bed he wakes up in the morning? Or who says what to him on Twitter?
Yes. No, I think the elections will have an impact. They already, they do have an impact. Because remember, I said earlier on that one of his main driving forces is his right-wing constituency and the promises he made to them. And one of those promises, which he hasn't done too bad, he hasn't succeeded as well as a few others, but he hasn't done too badly yet, was that he would end American role in foreign wars. So he hasn't got involved in any new war really. There's been a little increase in Syria, increase, decrease, whatever, but he hasn't got involved in any new wars. If he goes to war against Iran, it will be a new war. He'll be violating the promise he made, and for his constituency, except for building the wall with Mexico, he's done pretty well as far as they're concerned in terms of fulfilling the promises. So he doesn't want to send more American soldiers out to die. So I think that will weigh heavily in terms of his decisions, and that's why I think that despite his unpredictability, that a war with Iran is a remote possibility, not a very likely possibility.
Well, what do you make of the theory that the U.S. economy needs a war?
Yes, I mean the military industrial complex in the US, of course, is very influential over Trump, over all of the people around Trump, and they really survive because of wars. But Trump is a bit of an oddball in this regard. He doesn't that easily bow to these special interests. He has his constituency as a voting bloc, but these special interests are not as easily have their way with him, right? Not, for example, as they did with Bush, with two Bushes, or even with Obama, right? And so I think that while from their perspective they need wars to survive and to keep the economy going, I don't think that he would like to go as far as launching a new war in order to do that. He wants to continue selling weapons, and despite whatever Congress has said, he's decided that he's going to be selling weapons to, he's invoked emergency regulations in order to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So he'll continue selling weapons in order to firstly keep that interest group happy, but also in order to keep those American jobs, which is promised he will. But I don't think that he'll be keen to launch a new war. But again, it's a powerful lobby in the US, and he is surrounded by some people that want a war. I mean, his national security advisor, John Bolton, is desperate for a war against Iran. For him, it's an ideological thing. It's not rational, not realist. And to a lesser extent, but similarly, his Secretary of State, Pompeo, also wants a war with Iran.
Before we move on to the next region within the Middle East, just to focus on Trump a little more in terms of the chances that he has of winning re-election, coming back into office, because the US plays a very significant role in terms of how things develop in the Middle East, and whether it's Trump or whoever else is a factor in that regard.
Yeah, it definitely is a factor. Look, I think as things stand right now, I think that Trump has a good chance of getting re-elected. The Republicans are not going to dump him, certainly, and the Democrats don't seem to have got their act in order yet, and perhaps they could.
They're recycling old leaders.
They're recycling old leaders. Ironically, having said that, ironically, I think the best bet for the Democrats is an old leader, Bernie Sanders. Will probably be the best contender for Trump, because he has a message that is different. The others basically want to play to the same hymn sheet as Trump does, except that he does it better than they do. So I think that if Bernie Sanders is their choice, there's a possibility that he could win. If any of the others, I think that unfortunately Trump stands a very good chance of winning again.
All right, at that point, we'll take our next break. When we come back, we'll focus on other areas and regions within the Middle East. Welcome back. So we're discussing the Middle East. Our guest in studio from AMAC, we have named Gina. Prior to the break, we spoke quite a bit about Iran. The other region in the Middle East which has been in the headlines of late is Egypt, and that is because of the passing of do you say former president or still a deposed president, Mohammed Morsi. But it seems like as much as there was quite a bit of focus at the time of his demise, that it's already starting to wane. It doesn't had the kind of impact that those who were hoping that his demise would be a kind of catalyst for some sort of uprising, some sort of international pressure which could be sustained.
Yeah, look, in terms of international pressure, I think that it was a bit of a pipe dream to expect that would happen. The international community, including the African Union for that matter, which Sisi now heads, of course, has made peace with the fact that Morsi is gone, there's a new situation and a new reality that we have to live with. I think the whole international community has accepted that. One or two voices, of course, different. Erdogan from Turkey now and then, Hamas from Gaza now and then, but otherwise that has been the position. So the fact that he passed away, sure, it was a big thing for a week or 2 weeks, but frankly I think that for global powers it was a more comfortable thing. Having a deposed president in prison, not being allowed his medication, not being allowed to see his lawyers and all of that is very uncomfortable if you continue supporting the guy who deposed him. But now he's dead. It's gone, it's over, new life. So that's the one thing. In terms of civil society, because this was the other thing that many people said that Morsi's death, murder, as many people have called it, will result in kind of an insurrectionary environment within Egypt. The reality is that the repression in Egypt is extremely severe. Anyone that looks funny at Sisi's picture would get arrested. So we're not talking just about Islamists or Muslim Brotherhood people. Liberals, leftists, many of them who supported the coup when Sisi overthrew Morsi have been sitting in jail or have been in and out of prison. You're talking about 50,000 political prisoners at the moment. And that has meant that there's a great environment of fear and people really have no space to move, to organize or to do anything. So no, I don't think that Morsi's death is going to result in anything big.
With specific reference to the Ikhwan, to the Brotherhood, is it a case of them having been repressed and they've gone underground and they're biding the time, or is it a case of them being totally obliterated? You need a kind of resurrection or a totally new kind of resistance, for Egypt to find some sort of support from the ground for any counter to Sisi?
Look, I think the Ikhwan have proven over the past more than a century that, about a century now, that they are survivors. They withstood, or not withstood, that's not the correct term. They suffered great persecution under Nasser and came back thereafter. But I do think that this round is worse than what they had, and I think that Sisi has learned from what Nasser did and is doing it better. In terms of individuals, in terms of their families, persecution of them, in terms of seizing assets, in terms of closing down institutions, all of those things, he has done it better than Nasser did in the past. And so if we're talking about Ikhwan leaders and members, largely they're either in jail or in exile. And in exile in not very comfortable situations. So in the past when Ikhwan leaders, for example, went into exile, even in Europe, or leaders from, for example, Tunisia. I mean, Sheikh Rashid Al-Ghannouchi from Al-Nahda was in France, he was in the UK, and treated as a political exile. The environment is different now. They don't get the same kind of treatment. They now treated as terrorists. They looked at with suspicion, etc. So it is a different environment. Having said that, however, the Ikhwan is not only a movement or an organization, and it's not only Egyptian. It is more than that, an idea. And Sisi has attempted to destroy the idea, and I think that that's not going to succeed. Because the idea will continue outside of Egypt, even if it doesn't in Egypt for a while. And even those outside that regard themselves as Ikhwan or spin-offs of Ikhwan or linked to Ikhwan or whatever the case might be, still in some ways regard Egypt as the mother of the movement, Haraka, right? So I think that the current environment of repression is not sustainable in the long term. Economically, it's not sustainable. Egypt's economy is, it's bankrupt. It's going downhill very quickly, and its supporters that supported the coup are not as willing to put as much money in anymore. Partly because they're involved with all kinds of other adventures elsewhere, the Saudis, Emiratis, for example. But it's also not sustainable because you can't keep a lid that tightly over a boiling pot. So I think that it will ease up at some point in the future. The question is, how long will it take? And within Egypt itself, whether that idea of the Ikhwan, whether that flame will still exist when that happens. Outside it will, and there'll be attempts to revive it within. But I think it becomes more difficult if there's no core within.
Moving on from Egypt to Yemen, what's your assessment of the situation currently in Yemen?
Well, Yemen's a big mess. You have a situation where we don't have to go into the history with the Houthi movement and taking over the capital Sana'a, etc. But what we're having now over the past few years is these joint forces, Saudis and Emiratis in the lead, who believed that they would destroy the Houthi group within a few weeks, and it's been now a few years. They haven't succeeded. They're not close to it. The Emiratis have now announced, I think we have to take the announcement with a tablespoon or two of salt, but they've announced that they're withdrawing their troops. And so the question is why? Well, in my opinion, partly because they believe that they have set up their proxies in the south of Yemen strongly enough that they don't have to have their own troops there. They have been supporting secessionist groups in the south. So they have been, although in alliance, they've been at odds with the Saudis in terms of how they're dealing with Yemen. In Aden, for example, the president who the Saudis support has on more than one occasion been under siege at the airport because militia that are supported by the Emiratis have besieged him. So they're pulling out. Their interest really, or one of the big interests in Yemen, had nothing to do with the Houthis and all of that, but it was about securing the southern part so that they could get their pipelines from the UAE across to the ocean, to diversify their field of operations. You know that they're setting up, have set up already, bases along the East African coast, Somaliland, you know, that area. So they're very keen to secure the shipping lines, and I think that with the proxies they've set up and will continue supporting in the south, they seem comfortable. But the reality is that we have a country where the population has been extremely battered. You know, the statistics, cholera has not been this bad anywhere in the world ever, for example. The number of children that are at risk of starvation, that are malnourished at the risk of starvation, runs into hundreds of thousands, if not more. And the country will, if it gets peace tomorrow, will take possibly decades to recover. Yeah. And there seems to be no sense from the bombarding side, from the Saudi and Emirati side in particular, that this is a big deal. They've tried to play the kind of role that the US plays, which is bomb on the one side and give aid on the other. But even their aid giving hasn't been as quote-unquote successful as the Americans do it often. So it's one of the great tragedies of the Muslim world, I think, that this nation is brought to its knees.
What's the end game for Saudi in Yemen?
For Saudi, the end game is to destroy the Houthis. Now, I say now because to a large extent the Saudi end game has not been very long term in general, and particularly with Yemen. So a few years ago, they supported the Houthis under different circumstances. Right now, their end game is to get rid of the Houthis, and of course for them, Houthis also means Iran. When they started bombing the Houthis, Houthis didn't mean Iran as much as it does now. The Iranians kind of nominally supported the Houthis. Now they support them more. So for Saudi Arabia, it's get rid of the Houthis and thereby completely get rid of Iranian influence in Yemen. That's the end game. They're not going to succeed on either of those two. The end game will only come with a political solution, but no one's willing to be there right now.
Within the borders of Saudi Arabia, has Mohammed bin Salman in recent months, or perhaps in the last year or so, been able to consolidate his grip on power? Within the royal palace, are the rumblings as loud as they were perhaps 2 or 3 years ago?
He has quietened the rumblings, and that doesn't mean that they don't exist kind of underground. Or behind the niqab, right? But he's quietened the rumblings through intimidation, essentially. His big move, of course, was that period when he arrested a number of, dozens or scores of ulama, threw them in jail, because that was the one area he wanted to target, and then the other was the various sections of the state that were controlled by different parts of the royal family. Locked all of the prominent people up in the Ritz-Carlton, took a lot of their money as basically ransom in order to release them. And so in that move, in that period, what he did was he took over all the branches of the state that were controlled by different parts of the family since Saudi Arabia was formed as Saudi Arabia. So the National Guard, for example, which was Abdullah's family, always ran it. The intelligence services, the Naif family, all of that is now under his control. He's taken over large parts of the economy of Saudi Arabia that was controlled by individuals within the royal family, whether it's Walid bin Talal or whoever else. So he's got economic control. And the other kind of obstacle for him was this deal that has existed for a century, almost a century, with the ulama, where the monarchy and the ulama had this kind of understanding. They supported and protected each other, and they kind of kept out of each other's way, which means that they both had sovereignty in a sense. He's not interested in that kind of deal anymore. And so what we've seen is from that period about 2 years ago is that all the ulama who might be slightly or had the potential to be more critical, and I'm not talking about people like Salman al-Auda who has been critical, but even others who are less critical than him had the potential to speak out, were just locked up. And so the ones who are left are those who would get whacked over the head and they'd yabas basically. And through that, he's now kind of, and then, the various of his other things which are celebrated in the West is kind of, this is the moderate, liberal, whatever kind of leader, is really, as far as I'm concerned, I mean, two things. One is that he wants to keep the youth on his side, and Saudi youth, they might be very conservative looking in Saudi Arabia, but when they go to Europe, they do all kinds of other things. So he wants to keep them on his side by bringing Europe to Saudi Arabia. Yes, right. Mariah Carey, etc. And secondly, of course, secondly, I should say also to portray himself to the Western media or to the West as being one of them, liberal, moderate, the kind of Muslim you can deal with, etc. And thirdly, that this is also a way of undercutting the role of the ulama, because the ulama in Saudi Arabia have been, as you know, extremely conservative, right? So you push it to such an extreme that they like fish out of water. Yeah, and so I think that's where he's going. And so within the royal family, the dissatisfaction and discontent is there, but he has succeeded in keeping it quiet. I don't believe that that's a sustainable thing. I don't believe that he's going to be able to keep it quiet for a long time. Even soon after the Ritz-Carlton thing, you had lesser known princes who protested, got locked up, not in the Ritz-Carlton but in prison, that kind of thing. These were, technically they were princes, Saudi princes, and that will continue. Even among the youth that he's trying to attract, there will be a breaking point, because many of these young people come from different tribes and clans within Saudi Arabia, clans and tribes that have had a particular role in the state and no longer have that role, because he's brought all power under him. So I think that as unlikely as it might seem on the face of it, that he has begun the unraveling of the Saudi monarchy, because he's forcing it to unravel from within.
Right, time for our final break. When we come back, we continue. So we've been having a very interesting discussion about the latest when it comes to various regions in the Middle East. We've touched on the US-Iran issue. We've spoken about Egypt, Yemen and Saudi as well. And Naeem, time is running out on us very quickly. I want to still touch on Syria, Palestine and a bit of Turkey as well. Each one needs a kind of program on its own. Syria seems to... will stalemate be the kind of right word? Because it looks like now Assad can't really break this last frontier of resistance, but they are not strong enough to really seriously bother him as well.
No, I don't think stalemate is where it is. I think that the regime is, they're in control of most of the country except the north, the Idlib part, and that will get sorted out with Turkey, between Turkey and Russia. They're also flexing their muscles in all kinds of other ways as well. The latest kind of scandal now is the security arrangements that they are making with Israel. That's the Syrian government, brokered by Russia. So there seems to be a purge within the political and military elite in Syria to get rid of people that are more supportive of the Iranians. So there's a whole range of things taking place there. But I think that part of all of these machinations will be that the upcoming discussions, the Astana process, Russia, Turkey and Iran, there's a meeting coming up soon, and at that meeting there'll be agreements made about how Turkey will slowly pull back, and Assad will regain complete sovereignty. Turkey wants a few things and wants guarantees for some of the people that it supports, etc. But ultimately, that's where it's going to be. So I think that it's not a stalemate. I think by the end of this year or beginning of next year, the Syrian state will impose its control over the whole country.
So he's survived, and in other words, 8-9 years, but he's managed to pull through. To what would you attribute that? How did he manage to survive? Because in the initial stages, it looked like it was only a matter of time before Assad would be out.
Look, if it was just Assad or if it was just the Syrian state, that would have been very possible in the first couple of years. But what saved him at the beginning was the Iranians and Hezbollah, certainly from a military perspective and a strategic perspective. The Iranians came in not only with people on the ground, but training, military advisors, etc., and that made a huge difference. But that wouldn't have saved him until the Russians came in. The Russians came in at an opportune moment. It was a time when his main kind of heartland of support was being threatened, when even Damascus was possibly being threatened. They came in with their campaign, and although they came in saying that it's against the terrorists or against ISIS or whatever, those first couple of months when you look at the bombing campaign on the map, they didn't even touch ISIS, right? And that was what really saved him, and that helped the regime then to take back control in a very systematic way, to take back control over various parts of the country, to make all of these deals that resulted in the opposition being forced to be concentrated in Idlib, so that Idlib can be the last one and just bomb them away. So the Russian role made the largest difference from 2014. That also means, of course, that he is now very beholden to the Russians. And while earlier we would have said 2 or 3 years ago that he was very beholden to the Iranians, he's now decided that the Russians are more useful to him. And from what we've heard from Assad's allies and former allies, that's not unusual for him. If you think before the uprisings began, his allies included Erdogan and Tamim of Qatar, both of whom broke off relations with him, and they have said things similar to what we've heard Iranians say. He made promises, for example, to Khamenei, when Khamenei told him that, right in the early stage, that he should resolve this without or with minimal loss of blood. Gave a guarantee and went back and started bombing people. So I think that the Iranians are now, going to see the result of the support that they gave to him, because there's a real purge now.
Lastly, I didn't want to start with Palestine, because then we would have gone quite deep, and a number of these other areas that we perhaps don't speak about as often as we do Palestine would have got neglected. But is Netanyahu now on the political rope, so to speak? All these corruption allegations, the rerun of the election, and if he doesn't prevail, would that significantly change the dynamic in the short term?
I think he is on the ropes internally, right? He is on the ropes partly because of the corruption stuff. The fact that he couldn't come up with the government means that he's not as strong as he thought after the election. And subsequently, what is happening now is that there is a coalition of forces on the other side who didn't want to form a coalition before, but now they will, basically because anyone but Netanyahu. And so the so-called blue and white party with Gantz will likely, in a coalition, win the election, and he'll probably become the prime minister, because Labour is supporting him, others are supporting, Meretz is supporting him. So there's a good chance that Netanyahu will be out. Now, your bigger question, will it make a huge difference? I'm not sure. And the reason I say that is that because, although the Blue and White Party, for example, they're all Zionists, of course. But the Blue and White Party's view, for example, is they should cut off their links with occupied territories, give them their statehood and let them do whatever they like. It's too costly for Israel to be there. That's their kind of position. That's the position of many of the army military people. But Israeli society is extremely right-wing, much more right-wing than that position. So even if they win the elections, I'm not sure that they can push Israeli sentiment. I'm not sure that they will really want to seriously do that. They want an occupation that's less costly to the Israelis. But the sentiment on the ground is so far to the right and so racist that even if Meretz won the election, it would be difficult for them to change that in the short term.
Shukran so much for your time. As I mentioned, that each one of these regions, we could have an independent program or two or three on that. But it's good to have this roundup after a number of months of quite a bit of focus on the local politics with the elections and all of that. And we look forward to the next discussion, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. To the viewers, until next week, inshallah, fi amanillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
وامنح الناس حبك بيض الله قلبك بيض الله قلبك كن جميل المساعي وامنح الناس حبك بيض الله قلبك